Night had fallen over 17th century Europe. The wind carried a low hum from the east, a sound that was not the wind at all, but the steady rhythm of war drums. From the hills surrounding Vienna, thousands of torches flickered like restless stars. The Ottoman camp stretched beyond the horizon, an ocean of tents, banners, and steel. It was the summer of 1683, and the capital of Austria stood as the last wall between Europe and an empire that claimed to be unstoppable. "If Vienna falls," whispered an old priest in the shadows of St. Stephen's Cathedral, "Europe may fall with it." His words drifted through the candlelit gloom, trembling like the flame itself. The Ottoman Empire had crushed armies from the Balkans to Hungary. For centuries it had grown like a rising tide, swallowing kingdoms and faiths beneath its banner. Now, under the command of Kara Mustafa Pasha, a man both brilliant and merciless, that tide had reached the very gates of Vienna. 300,000 soldiers, disciplined, confident, and burning with zeal, surrounded the city. To them, this was destiny, the final conquest that would open the heart of Europe to the east. Inside the city walls, Count Ernst Rüdiger von Starhemberg stood upon the ramparts, his armor streaked with dust and sleepless nights. Below him, the streets were filled with fear and silence. Mothers clutched their children. The hungry lined up for crumbs. The bells of Vienna no longer rang for celebration. They tolled to warn, to pray, to remind the living that death waited just beyond the walls. "Hold the line," Starhemberg murmured to his men, his voice low but steady. "Every hour we survive brings hope." His soldiers nodded, though their faces betrayed exhaustion. They had been fighting for weeks, digging trenches, firing cannons, repairing breaches torn open by Ottoman artillery. Each dawn they counted the dead and then took their places again, refusing to yield an inch. Outside the gates, Kara Mustafa Pasha watched the city through the smoke of his campfires. He wore emerald green robes embroidered with gold, his hands resting calmly on the hilt of his sword. To him, the siege was not just a battle, it was divine purpose. He believed victory had already been written in heaven. By tomorrow, he told his lieutenants, Vienna will kneel. The generals bowed. Behind them, drums thundered again, echoing through the Danube Valley like the heartbeat of an empire. Inside the city, the contrast was haunting. In the great cathedral, what was once a place of music and worship had turned into a shelter, straw beds lining the marble floor, the smell of smoke and sweat replacing incense. A single candle flickered near the altar. A young woman knelt before it, her hands clasped tight, whispering a prayer that wavered between fear and faith. Around her, wounded soldiers rested, their bandages stained but their eyes open, listening to the distant drums. Outside, the nights grew longer, the days hotter. The wells began to dry, bread turned scarce. Still, Starhemberg refused to surrender. He sent messengers through secret tunnels and forest paths, begging for aid from the emperor, from Poland, from anyone who still had the courage to stand against the Ottoman storm. Every letter carried the same desperate plea: Vienna stands on the edge. Come before it is too late. The city's defenses held barely. When cannonballs struck the walls, entire streets shook, dust falling from the ceilings like rain. Children cried in silence, taught not to make noise lest they be heard. At night, the sky glowed red with the fires of the Ottoman camp, and the people of Vienna stared at that burning horizon, wondering how many more dawns they would see. Yet in the midst of despair, something stubborn survived. Hope, small, flickering, fragile but alive. It burned in every candle, lit in prayer, in every whispered hymn echoing through cellars and crypts. And though fear filled their hearts, the people of Vienna chose to fight for one more sunrise. In a hidden chamber beneath the city hall, Starhemberg signed the last of his letters and sealed it with wax. He handed it to a courier, a boy barely 16, face pale but eyes determined. "Ride fast," the commander said. "Find King Jan Sobieski. Tell him Vienna still breathes." The boy nodded, clutching the letter as though it were his own heartbeat. When the door closed behind him, Starhemberg looked toward the north, toward the lands beyond the mountains, where hope might yet be found. Outside, thunder rolled not from the heavens, but from the cannons of the Ottoman lines. Vienna shuddered again, and beneath that storm of fire and fear, a single question echoed through every street, every heart, every prayer: who will come to save Vienna? The messenger rode through the night like a ghost chased by thunder. Behind him, Vienna burned on the horizon, a red scar across the sky. Before him, through rain and wind, lay Krakow, the heart of Poland and the last hope of Europe. Inside Wawel Castle, King Jan III, Sobieski stood by the tall arched window, the flicker of candlelight reflecting in his armor. The letter from Vienna lay open on the table beside him, its seal broken, its words trembling with desperation. He read the last line again silently. Vienna still breathes, but not for long. For a long moment he said nothing. The room was filled only with the whisper of the storm outside. At last he spoke not to anyone in particular, but to the silence itself. If Vienna falls, he murmured, then Poland will be next. And after that, who will stand? His advisors watched him carefully. Some counseled caution. The Polish army was weary from years of war. Others spoke of faith, of duty to Christendom. Sobieski's wife, Queen Marie Casimir, entered quietly. Her voice was calm, but her eyes searched his face. "You already know your answer, January," he turned to her. "Yes," he said, his tone steady now. "God wills it." At dawn, the bells of Krakow rang not in fear, but in command. The city awoke to the thunder of hooves as messengers galloped through the streets. Within hours, banners were raised, drums rolled, and soldiers gathered in the square. The winged hussars, Poland's elite cavalry, assembled beneath the rising sunday. Their armor gleamed silver and gold, wings of eagle feathers arching from their backs. When the wind blew, those wings whispered like angels descending from the heavens. They were knights of faith and fury, and they knew that if Vienna fell, their homeland would be next. Sobieski rode out among them, his presence both fierce and fatherly. He looked into their faces, farmers, nobles, veterans, and saw the same fire burning in their eyes. "We ride not for glory," he told them, his voice echoing across the field, "but for the souls of those who cannot ride beside us." For every home, every church, every child who dreams of peace, the crowd answered with a single cry that shook the earth, "God wills it." The journey began. Through the vast plains of southern Poland, across the mist-shrouded valleys of Slovakia, and into the towering Carpathian Mountains, the army moved like a living river of steel. Rain lashed their faces. Mud swallowed their boots. Food ran scarce. But not a man turned back. At night by the campfires they spoke little. Some prayed. Some sharpened their blades. Sobieski often sat apart gazing at the distant peaks. In the crackling of the flames he saw the faces of those trapped in Vienna, the children, the soldiers, the priest, whispering prayers under siege. "Hold on," he whispered, "to the wind we are coming." Days turned into weeks. The storms grew harsher, yet so did their resolve. When their supplies ran out, villagers from remote hamlets appeared offering bread, water, and blessings. One old man bowed and said, "If Vienna falls, we all fall. Ride fast, Your Majesty." Sobieski nodded, pressing the man's trembling hand. "We will not let Europe burn." By the time they crossed the last ridge of the Carpathians, the sun broke through the clouds for the first time in weeks. Below them stretched the plains of Austria, green fields scarred by smoke. Far in the distance, they could see it, the black haze rising over Vienna. Sobieski raised his sword toward the horizon. The morning light flashed along the blade, scattering into 1,000 shards of hope. Behind him, tens of thousands of soldiers watched, their hearts pounding in rhythm with the drums. He turned in the saddle, his voice ringing clear as a trumpet. "Brothers," he shouted, "there lies the heart of Europe, and it still beats. Let the world remember, when faith and courage ride together, no empire can stand against us." The army roared in, answer a wave of sound that rolled through the mountains. Their banners lifted higher, white and crimson, the symbol of the cross blazing against the sky. The winged hussars spurred their horses forward, feathers catching the wind like living fire. As they descended toward Vienna, the ground trembled beneath their charge. Above them, the clouds parted, sunlight spilling down like a blessing. In that moment, the weary world of 1683 seemed to hold its breath. Hope was coming not as words or promises, but as thunder. And at its head rode Jan Sobieski, the Lion of Poland, the man who believed that faith itself could save a continent. The mountains behind them were still shrouded in mist when the Polish banners reached the hills outside Vienna. Below, the valley was drowned in smoke. Cannon fire echoed like thunder over the fields. It was the 12th of September 1683, the dawn of the day that would decide the fate of Europe. King Jan Sobieski rode to the ridge and halted. He looked down upon the city, battered, broken, but still standing. Beyond the walls, an enormous sea of tents sprawled across the plain, the Ottoman army glittering in the half-light like a living storm. He whispered to himself, "So this is where history holds its breath." In the Ottoman camp, Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha stood tall on a crimson carpet beneath a vast green banner. He wore his victory already, his robes immaculate, his eyes sharp with ambition. He believed this day was already written in the stars. By nightfall, he told his commanders, "The crescent will rise over Vienna. Allah has granted us triumph." The generals bowed low, though some exchanged uneasy glances. Behind them, soldiers beat the drums, their rhythms swelling like the heartbeat of an empire about to claim its prize. On the city walls, Count Starhemberg leaned on the battlements, his hands blackened with soot. He hadn't slept in days. When the first light of morning crept over the horizon, he saw something that made his heart stop. Far beyond the fog, faint but real plumes of dust. The glint of sunlight on steel. He shouted, his voice breaking, "They're here, by God, they're here!" From the towers of Vienna, the church bells that had long been silent began to ring again. Hope rolled through the city like fire through dry grass. Then came the sound, distant at first, then rising trumpets cutting through the morning air like blades. The armies of the Christian coalition emerged from the hills, Poles, Austrians, Germans, thousands strong. At their head, the winged hussars formed in rows, their armor catching the dawn, the great wings at their backs trembling like thunderclouds about to break. Sobieski turned to his officers. "This is the hour," he said, raising his sword. "No retreat, no mercy. We ride for faith, for freedom, for all of Europe." The drums of the coalition answered the drums of the empire, and then silence. For a moment, even the wind seemed to stop. The first cannon roared. Battle exploded across the plains. Ottoman guns belched smoke and fire. The ground trembled. Thousands clashed in chaos, swords, flashing banners, falling, the cries of men and horses blending into one terrible symphony. From above the ridges, Sobieski watched the lines waver and reform, waiting for the moment. Kara Mustafa smiled when he saw his enemies slow under the weight of his artillery. He turned to his aides. "Do you see? They falter. The city will fall before sunset." But in his confidence, he missed what was coming from the north. The winged hussars had taken position. Sobieski's gaze hardened. "Sound the charge." The command rippled down the line. Trumpets blared a cry so fierce it shook the sky. And then, with the roar of 10,000 hooves, the winged hussars descended the hill. The earth quaked beneath their charge. Their wings screamed through the air, a sound like a storm breaking open. The Ottoman lines shattered under the sheer force of it. Steel met flesh dust, swallowed the sun, and for one heartbeat it felt as if time itself had paused to watch. Kara Mustafa's tent shuddered as the thunder of hooves drew closer. He stepped outside just in time to see Sobieski's cavalry tearing through his flank like a divine wind. His pride collapsed into disbelief. "Impossible," he whispered. On the walls of Vienna, Starhemberg's men saw it all, the Ottoman ranks breaking their banners, toppling one by one. Cheers erupted, mingling with tears and prayers. Some soldiers fell to their knees, others raised their rifles to the sky, firing in triumph. In the chaos, Sobieski rode straight into the heart of the enemy camp. Dust, fire, and steel surrounded him. His horse was streaked with blood and sweat. He raised his banner high, white and crimson, and shouted so all could hear, "God wills it. Vienna is free." The last Ottoman flag wavered, torn by wind and smoke, and fell. A silence followed, deep, unreal, almost sacred. Then, from the walls of Vienna to the farthest hill, a sound rose that no empire could silence, the cry of victory, of faith renewed, of hope reborn. And in that echo, mixed with gunpowder dust and the tears of the living, the world changed forever. The battlefield was silent at last. Smoke drifted over the plains like ghosts searching for the fallen. Where the thunder of cannons had roared only hours before, there was now only the crackle of burning tents and the slow, steady toll of church bells from within Vienna. The sun sank low, painting the sky in blood and gold. Bodies lay scattered across the fields, soldiers of both empires tangled in the same dust. Among them, the people of Vienna moved like shadows, searching for loved ones, whispering prayers for the dead. Yet beneath the grief, something unbroken stirred a fragile, luminous joy. When the gates of Vienna finally opened, the defenders stumbled out to meet their saviors. They were gaunt, smoke-stained eyes, hollow from sleepless nights, but they were alive. And as the first Polish riders entered the city, a sound began to rise, quiet at first, then swelling the sound of a city remembering how to breathe. Men and women fell to their knees, reaching out to touch the hands of the soldiers who had come to save them. Some wept openly. Others simply stared in disbelief, as if afraid the moment would vanish like a dream. At the city's edge, Jan Sobieski dismounted his armor, dulled by dust and blood. He looked around at the ruins, the smoke, the survivors. A man who had seen too much death now stood in the midst of life again. From the crowd emerged Count Starnberg, limping slightly, his uniform torn his face, pale but resolute. He stopped before the Polish king and bowed deeply. "Your Majesty," he said hoarsely, "Vienna lives because of you." Sobieski reached out and lifted him by the shoulders. "No," he replied softly. "Vienna lives because you did not surrender." For a long moment, the two men stood there, surrounded by soldiers and citizens alike, no longer commander and ally but brothers bound by survival. Behind them, the cathedral bells rang again, their echoes washing over the wounded city. In the Ottoman camp, the scene was far different. Mustafa Pasha sat alone in the remnants of his grand pavilion, the great green banner of the empire torn and trampled outside. The air stank of smoke and defeat. He stared at the map spread across his table, Vienna circled in red, and felt the weight of it all crash down upon him. His officers avoided his gaze. None dared to speak the truth aloud. The army was broken, the dream of conquest gone. For years, the Ottoman Empire had seemed invincible, a tide that swallowed nations. Now that tide had met the walls of Vienna and stopped. He clenched his fists, whispering through gritted teeth. It was supposed to be destiny. But destiny, it seemed, had chosen another master. When the news reached Istanbul, the Sultan's fury was swift. Mustafa was summoned home in disgrace, a hero turned failure, a general without an army. History would say little of his final days, only that the empire never trusted him again, and with his downfall came the slow decline of an empire that had once reached the gates of Europe. Back in Vienna, the fires of the siege still burned, but now they glowed with warmth instead of fear. Children laughed again in the streets. Soldiers who had fought as strangers shared bread and stories beneath the same stars. In the cathedral, candles filled every window. The choir sang not for victory, but for deliverance. And in the back pew, Sobieski sat quietly beside his generals, his head bowed. When asked what he felt, he simply said, "Gratitude, not for glory, but for mercy." As the night deepened, the sounds of rebuilding began: hammers, striking carts, rolling voices calling to one another. Vienna, once on the brink of extinction, was alive with the stubborn rhythm of hope. From the city walls, one could see the plains still scarred by battle. The wind carried the faint echo of distant drums, but they were fading, now replaced by the steady ringing of church bells. A narrator's voice, soft and solemn, a great empire had stopped that day. But what truly endured was not the might of armies, nor the power of kings. It was the faith of men who refused to surrender, and the unity of those who stood together against the darkness. The music slows, the fires die down, and as dawn approaches once more, Vienna, scarred but unbroken, greets the morning light. The fires of Vienna faded into memory, but their light never went out. From the ashes of that battlefield, a new Europe began to rise. The victory of the 12th of September 1683 was more than a triumph of arms. It was the rebirth of a spirit, a reminder that courage and unity could turn the tide of history itself. In the months that followed, letters and messengers carried the news across kingdoms. From Rome to Paris, from Madrid to Warsaw, the bells rang. For once the crowns and crosses of Europe, so often divided by pride and politics, stood together in gratitude. The Holy League was born, a coalition of nations bound not by conquest, but by shared survival. Poland, Austria, Venice, and the Holy Roman Empire pledged to drive the Ottomans back from Europe's borders, and for the first time in generations, kings and commoners alike believed again that peace was possible, not because empires demanded it, but because people had fought for it side by side. Vienna became more than a city. It became a symbol, a scar that reminded Europe of its fragility and its strength. The Ottoman Empire, once thought invincible, began to retreat. The balance of power shifted. The great wave that had threatened to drown the continent had finally broken. But the true legacy of Vienna was never written in treaties or victories. It was written in the hearts of those who survived, in the soldier who laid down his sword to help rebuild a city, in the mother who lit a candle for both friend and foe, in the priest who rang the church bells, not for vengeance, but for peace. A narrator's voice, calm and reflective. History remembers battles by the numbers, how many fought, how many fell. But what it should remember is why they stood at all. The lesson of Vienna reached far beyond the 17th century. It whispered through time into every era where fear tried to divide and courage tried to unite. And perhaps for the listener today, wherever you may be, it still speaks. Because history has a way of repeating its questions. What will we stand for when darkness gathers again? Who will we become when the drums of division begin to beat? And do we still believe, as they did, that unity is stronger than fear? Voice softens. The music swells, strings rising slowly, a single trumpet echoing like memory. Courage, the narrator says, is not the absence of fear, but faith that stands against it. That was what drove the starving defenders of Vienna to hold the walls. That was what led Jan Sobieski and his riders through storms and mountains toward an uncertain dawn. And that was what allowed strangers who once called each other rivals to fight together for something greater than themselves. The story of Vienna is at its core a story about people, ordinary souls who refuse to surrender to despair. And though centuries have passed, its echo remains. Maybe it's in the quiet resilience of those who rebuild after tragedy. Maybe it's in every act of compassion that bridges a divide. Maybe it's in us when we choose to stand for one another, even when the odds say we shouldn't. The voice grows more intimate now, speaking not to an audience but to a single listener. The true power of Europe, it says, was never in its armies, but in its unity. The words linger hanging in the air like a final chord. The music fades to a soft hum, the sound of wind brushing through an open field. And as the story draws to a close, we are reminded of where it began, a city surrounded, a people afraid, a world on the brink. From darkness to light, from despair to deliverance, faith, unity, sacrifice. The final lines come slow, deliberate, filled with gratitude. From the walls of Vienna to every corner of the world, the lesson endures. When we stand together, not as nations, not as empires, but as human beings, no force can conquer us. That is the legacy of Vienna. That is the power of faith. And that is the power of us. Soft choral voices rise in the background, not triumphant, but reverent. The screen fades to black.